I think we can all agree that mixing concerns rarely leads to happy results, and right now we're getting our rancher-cluster.yml file created, but it ends up in our Ansible directory, and this is a bit confusing. As when looking at the directory structure, you can't really tell the difference between the rancher-cluster.yml file and any of the other playbooks, but this isn't a playbook, so perhaps this file doesn't belong in this directory at all. So what I'm going to do is create a new directory to hold our rancher-specific config, and then I'm going to update our Ansible setup to use this new directory. Now I'm creating my rancher2 directory at the same level in the hierarchy as my Ansible directory. All of these names and directories are entirely arbitrary, just update your config accordingly. And of course I've immediately caught myself out there by creating a file at the same level as my top level directory rather than inside my new rancher2 directory. Whoops. So the whole purpose of what we're trying to do here is to create our rancher-cluster.yml file, but keep that process distinct or separated from all the other Ansible stuff that we do. When we run the make create rancher-cluster.yml command, what we want to happen is exactly what was happening at the end of the previous video, which from a very high level point of view is that we were running the RKE cluster playbook and ended up with a new file called rancher-cluster.yml. So it kind of makes sense that because this is a more specific implementation of the generic run playbook command, we could start off by taking a copy paste of that entire command rather than typing it all out from scratch. Now we're going to need to make some changes to that, but it's a nice starting point. Now straight away, because we don't need to do anything with a remote server with this command, I'm going to get rid of the lines that set up the volumes for our SSH keys. There are 3 changes that we need to make. The first is that we're going to map a file called rancher-cluster.yml from our current directory to the path inside the resulting container of crv ansible rancher-cluster.yml. This is the most important file to us in this whole process. Next, we want to map a relative directory that goes one level up from our current directory and then down into the Ansible directory. And we want this to be mapped inside the container at the path of crv ansible. The last change that I'm going to make is rather than have the command variable at the end of the Ansible playbook command, I'm going to hard code this to run the RKE cluster.yml playbook. Now in theory at this point, this all should run and work as intended, but if we change across to our rancher2 directory and we run the make create rancher-cluster.yml command, we end up with quite a nasty looking error. Now for reasons I can't explain, the outcome of running this command on Linux is different from the outcome of running it on OS X. So in both cases we end up with a rancher-cluster.yml directory, which we don't want. We expected it to be a file, but it turns out to be a directory. But on Linux you will get a file inside that directory which would be called rancher-cluster.yml.j2, as in a Ginger2 template, but weirdly when you open that file up it's going to have all the correctly populated contents that we do actually want, but on OS X you don't get that file. Either way, it's not what we want properly anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Now what's going on here is that when we run the command, the file rancher-cluster.yml does not exist locally, and when we specify a volume to bind with a path that doesn't exist, then Docker, somewhat counterintuitively, will create a new directory with that name, and then it will use that to bind a volume inside the resulting container. So you might be thinking, okay, well, why not just create the rancher-cluster.yml file before running the make task? And that's a good shout, but we don't want to be doing that from a makefile command, as the makefile command would end up getting quite large. A better way to do this, in my opinion, is to create a shell script and then call that shell script from our makefile. So in short, all I've done here is created a directory called bin, which is supposed to hold binaries or executables. Then I've created a new shell script inside that bin directory and I've made it executable. Now the command that we want to run inside our shell script is exactly the same command that we've got currently as our create rancher-cluster.yml makefile command. So I'm going to cut that out and paste it into the shell script. Now we've given our file the .sh extension and we've made it executable, but in order to tell the operating system how to interpret this file, we need to add the shebang and then the interpreter, which in this case is bin.sh. Once I've done that, I'm able to use any of the command line utilities such as touch to create a new file. So I'm going to ensure that the rancher-cluster.yml file always exists. Now this should always exist from the second and subsequent times that we run this script. But if this is a brand new computer or this is the first time you're running the script, we want to make sure that the expected file exists. Now the syntax for getting access to the current working directory is different when you're in a shell script to how you do it inside a makefile. We've already covered this in a previous video. So make sure to update from cur-dir to pwd. I'm going to preemptively extract the Ansible dir path out into its own separate variable, and the reason for doing this is that we're still going to hit on that same problem that we saw a few moments earlier, where when we've run this command we're going to end up with this unwanted directory, and because we're running our Ansible commands from that relative path, that directory is going to get created inside that relative path, which is kind of intuitive now to us because we've followed through these tutorials. But for anyone else who's not seen these tutorials, perhaps another member of the team, this is going to be very confusing and they may not even notice that that directory ever got created. However, because our Ansible directory is under Git, when they go into that directory and they do a git status, they're going to see this new directory has been created, and it's really confusing as to where that's come from. Anyway, by removing that file at the end of our script run, we completely mitigate that problem. Now, I figured at this point that I would go ahead and delete the rancher-cluster.yml file myself manually so that we can see that when this script runs, the file itself is actually created as expected. What's really odd is you delete this and then it seems to delete, but then a few seconds later the machine kind of catches up with itself and thinks that the file wasn't there to begin with. So, little bit odd. I've seen this with VS Code before where the directory structure kind of gets out of sync, but I think that was related to the sort of the strange Docker madness around the volume mappings. Okay, so one way or another that problem seems to have worked itself out, and the next step that I want to take is to swap from using that long Docker command inside the makefile to instead calling our shell script. Now with that change done, even if we run the make create rancher cluster YAML command, we're still going to get a fairly unhelpful error. Now I wish I could say that I fully understand the root cause of this problem, but I don't. All I've found is what's in the documentation regarding writing files when inside a Dockerized environment, which we are, and in that case we need to use the rather scarily titled unsafe writes. Now there's a warning around that about data corruption and race conditions. This should never affect us, because if it does, all we need to do is rerun this command. It's really not mission critical. We can run this many times and there should be no real downside to doing so. But of course, if you was going to use this same situation for something a little bit more critical, then perhaps this wouldn't be the right solution. Okay, so we're pretty much looking good at this point. After running our makefile command, we don't see any of the unwanted leftover files inside our Ansible directory. And inside our rancher2 directory, we now get correctly outputted the rancher-cluster.yml file, correctly populated with all our Ansible inventory. We're going to use this configuration in the very next video to deploy Kubernetes via RKE.